I stood at the altar, ready to speak my vows. Behind me sat 300 guests in absolute silence. Suddenly, the sharp echo of high heels struck the marble floor. Before I could turn around, painted nails dug violently into my scalp. With a brutal jerk and the sickening tear of antique lace, my stepmother snatched my dead mother's wedding veil right off my head. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Violet Revenge Stories. Since YouTube has unfortunately disabled our channel's monetization, we no longer have the budget to keep operating normally. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to sustain their livelihoods and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Faith Crawford. I am 28 years old, and I work as a data analyst at Ethelgard Dynamics. At Ethelgard, my daily life revolves around identifying anomalies, tracing hidden patterns, and bringing order to chaotic streams of information. In my profession, we look for outliers, the pieces of data that refuse to conform to the established model. Perhaps that intensely analytical nature is what made me so acutely aware of the shifting dynamics and quiet anomalies within my own family. Since my earliest memories, the most magnificent possession in our household was not the sprawling Seattle real estate my father developed, nor the expensive cars parked in our driveway. It was a fragile expanse of 1920s Belgian lace. It was an exquisite, hand-stitched wedding veil, passed down through generations to my mother. The lace was intricate, woven with microscopic floral patterns that felt like spun sugar against the skin. Every delicate thread seemed to carry the weight of a century of vows, representing an unbroken line of love and devotion. When my mother wore it on her wedding day, she looked like royalty. When she passed away from a devastating and prolonged terminal illness, she took a vital piece of the warmth in our lives with her, leaving behind only shadows and that breathtaking, fragile veil. My father, Arthur Crawford, was a man of logic, blueprints, and brick. He built neighborhoods, residential towers, and commercial districts across Seattle. He was a good man, and he loved my mother deeply. But grief does strange things to a man accustomed to fixing problems with tangible solutions. For a time after my mother's death, the silence in our massive home was absolutely deafening. My father retreated into his work, his quiet stoicism masking a profound inability to process his sorrow. He simply did not know how to live in a house that felt like a museum dedicated to a ghost, and so, exactly 2 years after the funeral, he sought a cure for the echoing emptiness. He married Sylvia. Sylvia was a masterpiece of upper-crust American society. She possessed a flawless posture, a wardrobe composed entirely of expensive neutral tones, and a practiced smile that never quite reached her pale blue eyes. To the outside world, she was a graceful, stabilizing addition to the Crawford legacy, but inside the private walls of our home, I observed her with the same detached, clinical scrutiny I applied to compromised data sets. She was not a partner seeking to join a family. She was an invader securing a territory. Her impeccably polite demeanor was a highly effective cover for a deeply aggressive ambition. Sylvia did not just want to be my father's new wife. She wanted to completely eradicate the fact that he had ever been married to anyone else before her. The erasure was a masterclass in psychological warfare, slow, polite, and methodical. She never threw a tantrum or demanded my mother's belongings be thrown out. Instead, she orchestrated a quiet, relentless campaign of replacement. I would come home from college for the weekend to find that the beautiful oil portrait of my mother reading in the garden had been relocated to a dusty guest bedroom, replaced above the mantel by a modern, soulless abstract painting. When I asked about it, Sylvia placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my arm and softly explained that she was simply updating the aesthetic to bring more light into the room. Then went the vintage Persian rugs my mother adored, rolled up and sent to a remote storage facility, because Sylvia claimed the old fibers aggravated her seasonal allergies. Room by room, The essence of the woman who gave me life was surgically removed from the Crawford mansion, all under the guise of interior design. My father, desperate for peace and a semblance of normalcy, chose not to see the quiet violence of her actions. Sensing the inevitable conclusion of her territorial campaign, I made a preemptive strike. By the time I secured my job at Ethelgard Dynamics and rented my own apartment downtown, there was very little left of my mother in that sprawling house, but the veil remained. On the day I packed my belongings to move out, I bypassed the kitchenware and the expensive furniture. I walked straight into the master suite, retrieved the antique lace from its cedar chest, and took it with me. I spent hundreds of dollars having it carefully professionally cleaned by a master textile conservator. I then placed it inside an archival quality to climate-controlled preservation box. I stored this box on the highest shelf in the closet of my new bedroom. In my apartment, the veil was perfectly safe. It was entirely beyond Sylvia's manicured grasp, an untouchable fortress of memory that no decorator could ever paint over. But the physical distance did not sever Sylvia's awareness of the veil. In fact, her absolute inability to control its fate transformed it into a bitter obsession. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around dominance disguised as gracious hospitality, the veil was a glaring, unacceptable anomaly. It was a piece of Crawford history she could neither possess nor destroy. This gnawing frustration seeped out during our mandatory Sunday family dinners, manifesting as subtle, poisoned darts of conversation. The dining room table, long and made of polished mahogany, became her battleground. As the hired staff served roasted vegetables and fine cuts of meat, Sylvia would casually steer the conversation toward the concept of legacy and family unity. She would wait until my father was momentarily distracted, perhaps answering an urgent phone call from an investor, before locking her cold gaze onto me. "You know, Faith," she would murmur, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she carefully cut her steak. "I was speaking with a curator from the Historical Society the other day. It reminded me of that antique lace piece your mother owned. It really belongs in the shared family collection now, don't you think? It is a piece of Crawford history. Honestly, it feels rather selfish to keep it boxed up in a tiny apartment where no one can appreciate its historical value. We could have a custom, temperature-controlled display case built for the main gallery room here at the house." The audacity of her request always made my blood run cold. She did not care about historical value or family unity. She wanted to lock my mother's last sacred remnant behind glass in a house she now ruled, essentially taking the veil as a conquered trophy. I would lay my silver fork down, look her dead in the eye, and speak in the most even, restrained tone I could muster. "I appreciate your concern for its preservation, Sylvia," I would reply, "but the veil is a deeply personal heirloom, not a museum exhibit. It is perfectly safe right where it is." My father, sensing the sudden, freezing drop in the room's temperature, would finally look up from his phone, clear his throat loudly, and launch into a lengthy, desperate monologue about the fluctuating interest rates in the commercial property sector. Sylvia would merely offer a tight, conceding smile, taking a slow sip of her sparkling water. She never pushed the issue into a vulgar screaming match, but the glint in her eyes remained sharp and calculating. She was a patient predator, circling her prey, determined to claim the final victory over a dead woman. Life took a brilliant turn when Marcus proposed. Marcus was an independent investigative auditor, a man whose mind operated with the same relentless, analytical precision as my own. His career was built on dismantling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden financial assets across global networks. We spoke the same language of logic and evidence. When he asked me to marry him, the answer was an immediate, undeniable yes. We quickly settled on Grace Cathedral for the ceremony, drawn to its towering Gothic arches and the solemn, historical gravity of its stone walls. It felt like a fortress, a place where sacred promises would be protected. Because my father possessed a massive real estate empire, drafting a prenuptial agreement was an absolute requirement. Neither Marcus nor I had any objections. It was simply another data set to organize. Late one Tuesday evening, I logged into the secured internal servers at Ethelgard Dynamics to review my personal trust documents and outline my current assets. While running a standard reconciliation algorithm through the family's broader holding accounts, a glaring red flag interrupted my screen. There were anomalies, staggering, unexplainable anomalies. I found a series of heavily encrypted, sequential offshore wire transfers. The sums were not mere rounding errors. They were massive bleedouts. $400,000 had been routed to a bank in the Cayman Islands. 2 weeks later, $750,000 vanished into a holding company in Geneva. Exactly 30 days after that, another $1.2 million disappeared into an untraceable account in the Bahamas. I dug deeper into the digital authorization logs. These transfers had not been initiated by my father or his long-standing chief financial officer. They were executed by a newly added authorized proxy, a signatory that had been quietly integrated into the trust's back-end architecture just 6 months prior. When I showed the screen to Marcus, his romantic demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated focus of a seasoned investigator. We immediately transformed my apartment into a makeshift war room. For the next 48 hours, we barely slept. We cross-referenced the proxy signatures, traced the digital breadcrumbs, and began a deep dive into the meticulously curated past of my stepmother. What we discovered was a masterpiece of predatory financial engineering. The elegant, wealthy widow persona Sylvia had presented to my father was an absolute fabrication. Marcus pulled court records and bankruptcy filings spanning the last 15 years. Before marrying my father, Sylvia had been engaged 3 separate times to wealthy, older men. None of those weddings ever took place. Instead, each fiancé suffered a catastrophic financial collapse shortly before the wedding dates, followed immediately by Sylvia breaking off the engagement and disappearing with whatever liquid assets she had managed to secure. But she did not work alone. The offshore shell companies receiving my father's money were heavily obfuscated, hiding behind layers of corporate anonymity, but Marcus was relentless. He hacked through the layers of a holding firm registered in Delaware, finding the single common denominator linking every single offshore account. The managing director of these phantom corporations was a woman named Beatrice. We pulled the birth records. Beatrice was Sylvia's biological sister. They were running a highly sophisticated, systematic draining of the Crawford family fortune, and my father was simply their latest, most lucrative target. While Marcus and I were quietly building a digital indictment against her, Sylvia launched a tyrannical campaign to hijack my wedding. Her polite veneer began to crack, replaced by an aggressive, suffocating need for absolute control. She relentlessly vetoed my choices, insisting we hire obscure, unvetted vendors. She forced an unknown catering company upon us that charged an exorbitant $400 per plate, and a floral designer who demanded a staggering non-refundable deposit of $35,000 paid directly to a limited liability company. Furthermore, she decimated my guest list. She crossed out my close colleagues from Ethelgard Dynamics and replaced them with wealthy, elderly investors, claiming they were absolutely vital for my father's future zoning approvals. She was transforming my wedding into a high-stakes networking event, likely scouting her sister's next potential victim. The tension reached its breaking point during my final dress fitting. My best friend and maid of honor, Chloe, had always possessed a razor-sharp intuition and a fierce loyalty to me. She arrived at the boutique exactly 45 minutes early to drop off some accessories. As she walked down the plush, carpeted hallway toward the private viewing suite, she heard hushed, urgent voices coming from the back office. Chloe stopped, pressing herself against the wall to listen. Through the partially open door, she saw Sylvia standing over the boutique's owner. Sylvia's voice was low, venomous, and entirely stripped of her usual fake charm. "I do not care how you make it happen," Sylvia hissed, her tone like crushed glass. "Let the industrial steamer run too hot and scorch the fabric, or let your shears slip while you are making the final alterations. I will give you $10,000 in cash right now, and another $10,000 the minute that ceremony is over. All you have to do is make sure that disgusting antique lace veil is completely unsalvageable before she walks down the aisle." Chloe did not confront them. She quietly backed away, slipped out of the boutique, and called me immediately. As I listened to Chloe recount the attempted bribe, a chilling realization washed over me. Sylvia was no longer just a gold digger trying to steal my father's money. She was a deeply unhinged woman obsessed with destroying the last physical evidence of my mother's existence. The veil was not just an accessory to her. It was the ultimate symbol of my mother's enduring presence, and Sylvia was willing to commit a crime to destroy it. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the wedding was no longer just a ceremony. It was a trap. I drove to my father's corporate office on a rain-soaked Wednesday afternoon. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. In my purse, I carried a heavily encrypted flash drive containing the financial ruin of our family. I had braced myself for a massive, emotionally draining confrontation. I fully expected my father to fiercely defend the woman he had married, to accuse Marcus and me of dangerous paranoia, and to demand we leave his business affairs alone. When I walked into his spacious office on the 42nd floor overlooking the gray Seattle skyline, I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I spread the printed offshore wire transfers, amounting to nearly $2.3 million, across his polished mahogany desk. I took a deep, trembling breath, preparing to shatter his entire world. But my father did not gasp in horror. He did not yell or slam his fist on the desk. He simply picked up the top document, carefully adjusted his reading glasses, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "I know, Faith," he said quietly. I froze, the air leaving my lungs. He reached into his bottom drawer and pulled out a thick gray manila folder, tossing it next to my stack of evidence. Inside were surveillance photos, background checks, and detailed financial reports from an elite private intelligence firm. My father had suspected her for over 6 months. He had noticed the subtle discrepancies in the quarterly tax filings, but instead of confronting her and risking her liquidating the remaining accounts and fleeing the country, he had hired professionals to build an airtight, undeniable case. He looked 10 years older in that moment, his face etched with the bitter realization that his marriage was nothing but a calculated, long-term con. But beneath the profound sorrow was the terrifying, cold anger of a man who built empires and destroyed competitors for a living. We immediately brought Marcus into the office, and the three of us formed a silent, lethal alliance behind closed doors. The question was no longer if we would take Sylvia down, but how we would guarantee she never saw the outside of a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Marcus, ever the analytical auditor, pointed out a crucial flaw in our current body of evidence. The offshore transfers were technically authorized by a digital proxy, meaning Sylvia could potentially hire a high-powered defense attorney to claim she was manipulated, hacked, or entirely unaware, likely throwing her sister Beatrice under the bus to save herself. "We need absolute, undeniable proof of her malicious intent to defraud you directly," Marcus explained, tracing a complex line on the organizational chart he had drawn on the whiteboard. My father nodded slowly, a dark look crossing his eyes. "The marital trust," he said softly. My father revealed that Sylvia had been aggressively pushing him for 3 months to sign a total asset consolidation agreement. This was a sweeping legal document that would irrevocably merge all his individual corporate holdings into a joint account she fully controlled. He had been cleverly stalling her for weeks. "I will tell her I am finally ready to sign it," my father said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "But I will insist we do it on the morning of your wedding, as a symbolic, grand gesture of our united family moving forward." Once she signed that document, combining the prior fraudulent offshore transfers with an active, documented attempt to usurp his domestic assets, her crime would instantly escalate to first-degree wire fraud and grand larceny. The trap was perfectly set. We just had to survive until the ceremony without tipping our hand. The 7 days leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in psychological torture. The atmosphere inside the Crawford mansion was thick, heavy, and suffocating, exactly like the static electricity in the air right before a massive, destructive thunderstorm. It was a high-stakes chess match played out over catered lunches, final floral arrangements, and forced smiles. I had to suppress every analytical instinct I possessed. I forced myself to smile vacantly, playing the pathetic role of the oblivious, stressed bride who only cared about napkins and cake flavors. I nodded enthusiastically when Sylvia loudly complained about the seating chart. I thanked her profusely when she presented me with an ugly, overpriced pearl necklace she violently insisted I wear instead of my own jewelry. My total compliance seemed to fuel her madness, without the quiet resistance she usually faced from me. Sylvia's ego ballooned to dangerous, unstable proportions. She began treating the household staff with open contempt, aggressively ordering them around as if she were already the sole, undisputed owner of the estate. She fired the head housekeeper of 15 years over a single misplaced salad fork, completely confident that my father would blindly back her up. The arrogance was palpable, a toxic, invisible cloud that followed her every move. She thought she had won the war. She thought we were all entirely blind to the hangman's noose we were quietly tightening around her neck. Then, exactly 48 hours before the ceremony, the unpredictable element arrived and shattered the fragile dynamic. Beatrice landed in Seattle. Sylvia introduced her to everyone as a highly successful venture capitalist from New York, here to celebrate the joyous occasion. Beatrice was a sharper, more nervous, and more volatile version of Sylvia. Her eyes were constantly darting around the mansion, silently calculating the auction value of every painting, rug, and sculpture. The immense pressure of the impending massive fraud was clearly fracturing their criminal partnership. On the night of the rehearsal dinner, the tension finally snapped. Chloe had slipped into the mansion's massive walk-in pantry to find a specific vintage of champagne I had requested. The pantry shared a thin, uninsulated ventilation wall with the main catering kitchen. While standing perfectly still in the dark, Chloe heard two women storm into the kitchen, slamming the door behind them. It was Sylvia and Beatrice. Their voices were hushed, venomous, and laced with absolute raw panic. "You are running out of time," Beatrice hissed violently, her voice vibrating through the vent. "The Geneva account is flagging the deposits. We need the physical assets liquidated immediately, and we need that consolidation document signed today." "He is signing it tomorrow morning, you paranoid fool," Sylvia snapped back, sounding equally unhinged. "I have it all completely under control." "No, you absolutely do not," Beatrice growled, her voice dropping an octave. "She still has that antique veil. It is insured for $300,000. It is the only liquid, untraceable collateral we can easily grab if the bank accounts freeze. You must seize the collateral before those vows are finished, or I am leaving the country without you." Chloe relayed every word of that terrifying conversation to me as we sat locked inside my apartment late that night. A cold, terrifying clarity settled over my bones. Sylvia was not just going to try to ruin the veil with a spilled glass of wine or a torn seam. She was actively planning a physical, desperate, and public theft right in the middle of my wedding ceremony. The morning of the ceremony dawned gray, heavy, and ominously quiet. While the professional makeup artists fussed over my face, I asked them to leave the suite. I needed to sit in front of the mirror entirely alone. I took the fragile, antique Belgian lace from its protective preservation box. My hands did not shake. They were as steady as stone. I carefully draped the century-old fabric over my intricately styled hair. Then, I opened a small velvet box containing over 40 specialized, heavy-duty steel theatrical hairpins, one by one. I drove the thick metal pins through the delicate lace and deep into the tightly woven braids resting flat against my scalp. I wove them in a complex, interlocking grid, anchoring the fabric to my head with the unyielding strength of industrial fasteners. Every single pin felt like a nail securing my resolve. I was deliberately preparing myself for a violent physical assault at the altar of a holy church. I stared at my reflection, feeling the immense, heavy physical pressure of the steel pins pulling tightly at my skin. The bomb was armed. The timer was ticking down to 0, and I was completely ready to walk straight down the aisle and into the blast radius. The heavy oak doors of Grace Cathedral groaned open, revealing a breathtaking expanse of arched stone and stained glass bathed in the golden, late afternoon sun. The massive pipe organ began to play, its deep, resonant chords vibrating through the ancient floorboards and traveling straight up into my bones. As I linked my arm through my father's, I could feel the solid, comforting weight of his presence. We began the long, slow walk down the central aisle. The air inside the sanctuary was cool, thick with the scent of burning beeswax candles and the hundreds of white lilies meticulously arranged around the altar. Every eye in the cavernous room was fixed on us. But my gaze was locked solely on Marcus. He stood at the end of the aisle, perfectly composed, wearing a sharply tailored black tuxedo. When we finally reached the altar, the music swelled to a triumphant finish before fading into absolute reverent silence. My father placed my trembling hand directly into Marcus's. As he did, he gave my fingers one sharp, incredibly firm squeeze, a silent, powerful confirmation between the two of us that the trap was set and the line had been irrevocably drawn. The priest, a kind man with a gentle voice, began the sacred liturgy. The ceremony flowed seamlessly, a beautiful illusion of peace and tradition. We exchanged the ceremonial rings, the cold bands of gold sliding easily over our skin. Then, it was time for the vows. I took a deep breath, looking into Marcus's steady eyes, and began to speak the words I had written. My voice echoed clearly across the vaulted ceilings, projecting out to the 300 guests sitting motionless in the pews behind us. I was exactly halfway through my second sentence when the atmosphere in the cathedral violently shifted. The sudden, chilling silence was not born of reverence, but of mass confusion. It started at the back of the room and rippled forward like a dark, invisible wave. Then, a sound shattered the quiet. It was the sharp, frantic, aggressive clack of stiletto heels striking the polished marble floor. The footsteps were not walking. They were charging, moving with a desperate, heavy, frantic speed straight up the center aisle. The sound was horribly wrong, completely alien to the sacred, measured rhythm of a wedding mass. I saw Marcus's eyes widen, his jaw clenching as his focus snapped to something directly behind my back. Before my brain could even send the signal to turn my head, the physical assault began. A pair of hands, cold and manic, crashed down onto the back of my head. Long, hardened acrylic nails dug viciously through my intricately braided hair, violently scraping against my scalp with the force of an animal's claws. The sensation was blinding, a sudden, explosive shock of pain that radiated down my neck. I gasped, a harsh, ragged sound that was instantly drowned out by the noise that followed. The attacker seized a massive handful of the antique Belgian lace. With a guttural, feral grunt of exertion, the hands yanked backward with terrifying, brutal force. The 40 steel theatrical pins I had meticulously driven into my hair held fast for a fraction of a second, causing my neck to snap back painfully. Then, the delicate, century-old fabric gave way. The sound of the lace tearing was absolutely horrific. It was a loud, sharp, agonizing rip, like thick canvas being shredded right next to my ear. It echoed violently off the stone walls, a sound so entirely foreign and violent in that holy space that several guests cried out in shock. The heavy steel pins were ripped from my scalp, sending sharp, stinging pinpricks of blood welling up at the roots of my hair. I stumbled forward from the force of the blow, caught instantly by Marcus's strong, steadying arms. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, to face the desecration. Standing exactly 5 feet away, right in the center of the grand aisle, was Sylvia. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath her expensive silk dress. Her perfectly coiffed hair was slightly disheveled, but her eyes were entirely wild, burning with a frantic, feverish, terrifying triumph. In her right hand, she gripped the torn, ruined remains of my mother's priceless antique veil. She held the shredded lace high above her head, her fist clenched tight, displaying it to the frozen congregation as if it were the severed head of a conquered enemy on a battlefield. The 300 guests were paralyzed, trapped in a collective nightmare. No one breathed. No one moved. The silence was so profound, so absolute, that the only sound remaining was the frantic, ragged rasp of Sylvia's breathing, slowly, with a terrifying, deliberate arrogance. Sylvia lowered her arm. She took the shredded, damaged heirloom, the fabric my mother had worn with such grace, and draped it carelessly over her own head. The torn edges hung jaggedly over her face. She looked like a grotesque, mocking parody of a bride. She tilted her chin upward, scanning the horrified faces of the wealthy investors, family members, and friends sitting in the pews. A slow, chilling, utterly victorious smile stretched across her painted lips. "It is done," Sylvia declared, her voice ringing out sharp, loud, and entirely unhinged across the cavernous cathedral. "The entire Crawford legacy, every single asset, property, and heirloom now officially belongs to me." Marcus instantly moved, stepping directly in front of me. His broad shoulders created an impenetrable physical barrier between my bleeding scalp and the deranged woman parading in my mother's shredded lace. His voice, typically measured and analytical in corporate boardrooms, erupted with the sudden, terrifying force of a thunderclap. "Step down from the altar. Sylvia, right now," Marcus commanded. His words cracked like a heavy whip across the paralyzed cathedral, echoing violently off the towering vaulted ceilings. The sheer, commanding authority in his tone would have made any reasonable person freeze in their tracks, but Sylvia was entirely past the point of reason. She had completely crossed the threshold into absolute madness. She threw her head back and let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that bounced off the stained glass windows like shattered glass. "Step down?" she shrieked, taking another aggressive, stomping step forward. "I own this altar. I own the ground you are standing on. I own every single brick of Ethelgard Dynamics and every residential tower Arthur ever built." She pointed a furiously manicured finger directly at me, her pale blue eyes ablaze with a toxic, unfiltered hatred. "You pathetic, clinging little girl, you really thought you could preserve that dead woman's memory? Your mother is dust, faith, and you are nothing but a weak, sentimental shadow of a ghost. For 4 agonizing years, I have played the perfect, devoted wife. I smiled at your utterly boring family dinners. I tolerated your father's endless, monotonous speeches about commercial zoning laws, fluctuating interest rates, and construction permits. I endured the sheer, mind-numbing agony of this mediocre existence while I meticulously drained the lifeblood out of the Crawford empire. I pulled the strings. I moved the capital. I am the supreme architect of this family's future, and you are entirely obsolete." The 300 guests gasped in unison, a collective, physical sound of pure horror rippling through the heavy oak pews. Wealthy investors, lifelong family friends, and business partners sat completely immobilized, witnessing the brutal, unmasked destruction of a marriage in real time. But the most terrifying reaction did not come from the shocked crowd. It came from the very first row. My father, Arthur Crawford, did not shout, he did not curse, and he did not show a single ounce of the devastation that must have been tearing through his chest. He simply stood up from his seat. The cathedral was so profoundly quiet that the subtle rustle of his expensive suit fabric was entirely audible. With agonizing slowness, he reached down and fastened the middle button of his charcoal vest. He adjusted his cuffs with the meticulous, practiced precision of a man preparing to close a routine, high-stakes business deal. He stepped out into the center aisle and walked deliberately, unhurriedly toward the woman who had just publicly confessed to dismantling his life's work. Sylvia's crazed. Victoria's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as my father approached, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. but she quickly recovered. Lifting her chin defiantly, she fully expected him to crumble into a broken mess, to beg for an explanation, or perhaps to physically attack her in a blind, humiliated rage. But my father bypassed the expected human reactions entirely, residing instead in a realm of absolute, freezing detachment. He stopped precisely 2 feet away from her, without uttering a single syllable of reproach. He slid his right hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew a thick, sealed brown manila folder. He held it out, suspended in the tense space between them, a silent offering delivered under the watchful eyes of hundreds of silent witnesses. Sylvia sneered, a look of ravenous, unchecked greed washing over her flushed face. "Finally!" she spat, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "The total asset consolidation agreement. You actually brought the signed papers to the wedding just like you promised. How remarkably obedient and predictable of you." "Arthur." She violently snatched the heavy folder from his steady hand, her fingers tearing eagerly at the paper seal. She flipped the thick cover open, her eyes darting greedily toward the first page, fully expecting to see the legal transfer of a massive real estate empire into her sole possession. She expected the keys to the kingdom. Instead, the arrogant flush of victory drained from her face so rapidly, she appeared to turn to solid stone. The papers she held were not asset consolidation forms. The very first page was a high-resolution, certified bank statement from the Cayman Islands, highlighting a $400,000 fraudulent wire transfer. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she frantically flipped to the next page. Beneath that lay the Geneva Holding Company records, detailing the $750,000 theft. Then came the Bahamas offshore routing numbers and the heavily documented digital footprints connecting every single transaction directly to her sister Beatrice. Page after page of undeniable, federally certified proof of her massive embezzlement scheme stared back at her in stark black and white, and resting right at the bottom of the meticulously organized stack of criminal evidence, glaring up at her with heavy black ink, was a finalized, aggressively drafted petition for immediate divorce, already bearing a judge's preliminary seal. The silence in the cathedral shifted from shock to a suffocating, heavy anticipation. Sylvia's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, like a fish pulled violently from the water, but no sound emerged. The shredded antique lace still draped absurdly over her head no longer looked like a crown of victory. It looked like a ragged, pathetic shroud. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her, crushing her delusions of grandeur into fine dust. She had spent years orchestrating the perfect theft, only to realize that my father had been quietly, methodically building her a pristine, inescapable cage. My father did not lower his gaze as Sylvia stared in absolute horror at the financial documents detailing her long history of crimes. Instead, he slowly turned away from her trembling figure and faced the congregation. The 300 guests were leaning forward in their polished wooden pews, completely captivated by the sudden and dramatic unfolding of absolute justice. Arthur raised his voice just enough to command the massive, echoing space. "My daughter and her future husband are exceedingly meticulous people," my father announced, his tone steady and entirely devoid of pity. "We knew about the offshore transfers, we knew about the hidden shell companies in Geneva and the Bahamas, but corporate fraud can be tangled in years of tedious litigation. We needed a crime so undeniable, so brazen, that not even the most expensive defense attorney could manipulate the narrative. We needed an act of physical theft." My father gestured calmly toward the ruined, delicate antique lace still clinging absurdly to Sylvia's disheveled hair. "That veil is appraised at over $300,000. Woven into the base of its jeweled comb is a microscopic global positioning system tracker, securely embedded by Marcus exactly 3 days ago. By violently tearing it from my daughter's head and claiming it as your own in front of 300 witnesses, you did not just ruin a wedding ceremony. Sylvia, you committed felony grand larceny in broad daylight, and that was the final piece of evidence the authorities required to execute the arrest warrants we filed yesterday morning." the moment the words arrest warrants echoed through the cathedral. A sharp commotion erupted near the eastern transept. Beatrice had finally grasped the terrifying, catastrophic reality of their crumbling situation. I caught sudden movement out of the corner of my eye. Sylvia's sister had abandoned her front row seat and was sprinting frantically toward a heavy wooden side exit, her expensive heels slipping wildly on the polished marble floors. She threw her entire body weight against the thick iron handle, pulling the heavy door open and stepping out into the side vestibule. Her desperate attempt at a clean escape lasted exactly 2 agonizing seconds. The heavy oak door violently swung back open, nearly hitting the stone wall. Beatrice was shoved roughly backward into the sanctuary, stumbling awkwardly and collapsing onto the hard stone floor. Stepping through the doorway were 2 tall, imposing federal agents dressed in dark plainclothes suits. They did not say a single word. They simply stood over Beatrice, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, effectively sealing off the only exit. Sylvia watched her sister fall, and the last remaining fragment of her arrogant facade shattered completely. Her pale blue eyes darted wildly around the large room, searching for a sympathetic face, a legal loophole, any avenue of escape. But she was entirely surrounded by the very society she had tried to manipulate and steal from. The realization crushed her. My father's legal team and the global banking authorities had already completely frozen her illicit offshore accounts at exactly 8 o'clock this very morning. She had no money, no power, and absolutely nowhere to run. Her knees buckled under the invisible weight of her complete and total defeat. Her hands went limp. The shredded Belgian lace veil slipped from her grasping fingers, fluttering silently through the air before landing in a soft, white pool on the cold floor. 2 more federal agents emerged from the main entrance at the back of the church. Walking briskly down the long center aisle, they approached Sylvia with cold, professional efficiency. The metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around her wrists sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet cathedral. Sylvia did not scream or fight back. She was entirely hollowed out, a broken shell of a woman. The agents turned her around and marched her down the long aisle, her expensive shoes dragging against the stone. She was led out of the grand cathedral in absolute, dead silence, leaving nothing behind but the ruins of her malicious ambition. I stood at the altar, feeling the cool air against my neck where the heavy steel pins had been. The terror and tension that had suffocated me for weeks evaporated entirely, replaced by an overwhelming, profound sense of lightness. I took a deliberate step forward and knelt down on the marble. I gently picked up the torn, beautiful lace of my mother's veil. It was damaged, but its historical spirit remained entirely intact. I stood back up and walked over to Chloe. My best friend had happy tears streaming down her face. I handed the precious fabric to her, and she held it against her chest like a newborn child. Then, I turned back to Marcus. My brilliant, protective partner was watching me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. I looked into his eyes and smiled. It was the brightest, most genuine, and most liberated smile I had ever felt. The dark, looming shadow of my stepmother was permanently erased from our lives. We were finally free. The gentle priest, who had been standing frozen near the baptismal font, slowly stepped back up to his wooden podium. He looked at the congregation, looked at us, and softly cleared his throat into the microphone. That small, human sound broke the heavy spell. A single person in the back row began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire cathedral erupted into a thunderous, deafening roar of applause. It was a massive wave of cathartic, joyful relief washing over the room. The guests stood on their feet, cheering for the triumph of truth over deception. I reached out and took Marcus by the hands, holding them tightly. The priest gave us a warm, encouraging nod. As the beautiful applause slowly died down, I took a deep breath, looked deeply into the eyes of the man I loved, and continued reading the rest of my vows, completely closing the door on the ghost of the past. Thank you so much to every single one of you for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can do this easily by scanning the donation QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous contribution goes directly to paying our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and empowering them to continue creating these high-quality stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and take care.